A Man from Glasgow, a short story by Somerset Maugham. It is not often that anyone entering a great city for the first time has the luck to witness such an incident as engaged Shelley's attention when he drove into Naples. A youth ran out of a shop, pursued by a man armed with a knife. The man overtook him and with one blow in the neck, laid him dead on the road. Shelley had a tender heart. He didn't look upon it as a bit of local colour. He was seized with horror and indignation. But when he expressed his emotions to a Calabrian priest who was travelling with him, a fellow of gigantic strength and stature, the priest laughed heartily and attempted to quiz him. Shelley says he never felt such an inclination to beat anyone. I have never seen anything so exciting as that, but the first time I went to Algeciras, I had an experience that seemed to me far from ordinary. Algeciras was then an untidy, neglected town. I arrived somewhat late at night and went to an inn on the quay. It was rather shabby, but it had a fine view of Gibraltar, solid and matter-of-fact across the bay. The moon was full. The office was on the first floor, and a slatternly maid, when I asked for a room, took me upstairs. The landlord was playing cards. He seemed little pleased to see me. He looked me up and down, curtly gave me a number, and then, taking no further notice of me, went on with his game. When the maid had shown me to my room, I asked her what I could have to eat. "What you like," she answered. I knew well enough the unreality of the seeming profusion. "What have you got in the house?" "You can have eggs and ham." The look of the hotel had led me to guess that I should get little else. The maid led me to a narrow room with whitewashed walls and a low ceiling, in which was a long table laid all ready for the next day's luncheon. With his back to the door sat a tall man, huddled over a brasero, the round brass dish of hot ashes which is erroneously supposed to give sufficient warmth for the temperate winter of Andalusia. I sat down at table and waited for my scanty meal. I gave the stranger an idle glance. He was looking at me, but meeting my eyes, he quickly turned away. I waited for my eggs. When at last the maid brought them, he looked up again. "I want you to wake me in time for the first boat," he said. "Sai, senor." His accent told me that English was his native tongue, and the breadth of his build, his strongly marked features, led me to suppose him a northerner. The hardy Scot is far more often found in Spain than the Englishman. Whether you go to the rich mines of Rio Tinto, or to the bodegas of Jerez, to Seville or to Cadiz, it is the leisurely speech of beyond the Tweed that you hear. You will meet Scotsmen in the olive groves of Carmona, on the railway between Algeciras and Bobadilla, and even in the remote cork woods of Merida. I finished eating and went over to the dish of burning ashes. It was midwinter, and the windy passage across the bay had chilled my blood. The man pushed his chair away as I drew mine forwards. "Don't move," I said. "There's heaps of room for two." I lit a cigar and offered one to him. In Spain, the Havana from Gib is never unwelcome. "I don't mind if I do," he said, stretching out his hand. I recognized the singing speech of Glasgow, but the stranger was not talkative, and my efforts at conversation broke down before his monosyllables. We smoked in silence. He was even bigger than I had thought, with great broad shoulders and ungainly limbs. His face was sunburned, his hair short and grizzled. His features were hard. Mouth, ears, and nose were large and heavy, and his skin much wrinkled. His blue eyes were pale. He was constantly pulling his ragged grey moustache. It was a nervous gesture that I found faintly irritating. Presently, I felt that he was looking at me, and the intensity of his stare grew so irksome that I glanced up expecting him, as before, to drop his eyes. He did indeed for a moment, but then raised them again. He inspected me from under his long, bushy eyebrows. "Just come from Gib?" he asked suddenly. "Yes. I'm going tomorrow, on my way home, thank God." He said the last two words so fiercely that I smiled. "Don't you like Spain?" "Oh, Spain's all right." "Have you been here long?" "Too long. Too long." He spoke with a kind of gasp. I was surprised at the emotion my casual inquiry seemed to excite in him. He sprang to his feet and walked backwards and forwards. He stamped to and fro like a caged beast, pushing aside a chair that stood in his way, and now and again repeated the words in a groan. "Too long, too long." I sat still. I was embarrassed. To give myself countenance, I stirred the brasero to bring the hotter ashes to the top, and he stood suddenly still, towering over me, as though my movement had brought back my existence to his notice. Then he sat down heavily in his chair. "Do you think I'm queer?" he asked. "Not more than most people," I smiled. "You don't see anything strange in me?" He leant forward as he spoke so that I might see him well. "No. You'd say so if you did, wouldn't you?" "I would." I couldn't quite understand what all this meant. I wondered if he was drunk. For 2 or 3 minutes he didn't say anything, and I had no wish to interrupt the silence. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. I told him. "Mine's Robert Morrison." "Scotch?" "Glasgow. I've been in this blasted country for years. Got any baccy?" I gave him my pouch and he filled his pipe. He lit it from a piece of burning charcoal. "I can't stay any longer. I've stayed too long, too long." He had an impulse to jump up again and walk up and down, but he resisted it, clinging to his chair. I saw on his face the effort he was making. I judged that his restlessness was due to chronic alcoholism. I find drunks very boring, and I made up my mind to take an early opportunity of slipping off to bed. "I've been managing some olive groves," he went on. "I'm here working for the Glasgow and South of Spain Olive Oil Company Limited." "Oh, yes." "We've got a new process for refining oil, you know. Properly treated, Spanish oil is every bit as good as Lucca, and we can sell it cheaper." He spoke in a dry, matter-of-fact, business-like way. He chose his words with Scotch precision. He seemed perfectly sober. "You know, Exeter is more or less the center of the olive trade, and we had a Spaniard there to look after the business. But I found he was robbing us right and left, so I had to turn him out. I used to live in Seville. It was more convenient for shipping the oil. However, I found I couldn't get a trustworthy man to be at Exeter, so last year I went there myself. Do you know it?" "No." "The firm has got a big estate 2 miles from the town, just outside the village of San Lorenzo, and it's got a fine house on it. It's on the crest of a hill, rather pretty to look at, all white, you know, and straggling, with a couple of storks perched on the roof. No one lived there, and I thought it would save the rent of a place in town if I did." "It must have been a bit lonely," I remarked. It was. Robert Morrison smoked on for a minute or two in silence. I wondered whether there was any point in what he was telling me. I looked at my watch. "In a hurry?" he asked sharply. "Not particularly. It's getting late." "Well, what of it?" "I suppose you didn't see many people," I said, going back. "Not many. I lived there with an old man and his wife who looked after me, and sometimes I used to go down to the village and play tresillo with Fernandez, the chemist, and 1 or 2 men who met at his shop. I used to shoot a bit and ride. It doesn't sound such a bad life to me. I'd been there 2 years last spring. By God, I've never known such heat as we had in May. No one could do a thing. The labourers just lay about in the shade and slept. Sheep died and some of the animals went mad. Even the oxen couldn't work. They stood around with their backs all humped up and gasped for breath. That blasted sun beat down, and the glare was so awful you felt your eyes would shoot out of your head. The earth cracked and crumbled, and the crops frizzled. The olives went to rack and ruin. It was simply hell. One couldn't get a wink of sleep. I went from room to room, trying to get a breath of air. Of course, I kept the windows shut and had the floors watered, but that didn't do any good. The nights were just as hot as the days. It was like living in an oven. At last, I thought I'd have a bed made up for me downstairs on the north side of the house in a room that was never used, because in ordinary weather it was damp. I had an idea that I might get a few hours' sleep there at all events. Anyhow, it was worth trying. But it was no damned good. It was a washout. I turned and tossed, and my bed was so hot that I couldn't stand it. I got up and opened the doors that led to the veranda and walked out. It was a glorious night. The moon was so bright that I swear you could read a book by it. Did I tell you the house was on the crest of a hill? I leant against the parapet and looked at the olive trees. It was like the sea. I suppose that's what made me think of home. I thought of the cool breeze in the fir trees and the racket of the streets in Glasgow. Believe it or not, I could smell them, and I could smell the sea. By God, I'd have given every bob I had in the world for an hour of that air. They say it's a foul climate in Glasgow. Don't you believe it? I like the rain and the grey sky and that yellow sea and the waves. I forgot that I was in Spain, in the middle of the olive country, and I opened my mouth and took a long breath, as though I were breathing in the sea fog. And then all of a sudden I heard a sound. It was a man's voice. Not loud, you know. Low. It seemed to creep through the silence like, well, I don't know what it was like. It surprised me. I couldn't think who could be down there in the olives at that hour. It was past midnight. It was a chap laughing. A funny sort of laugh. I suppose you'd call it a chuckle. It seemed to crawl up the hill, disjointedly. Morrison looked at me to see how I took the odd word he used to express a sensation that he didn't know how to describe. I mean, it seemed to shoot up in little jerks, something like shooting stones out of a pail. I leant forward and stared. With the full moon, it was almost as light as day, but I'm dashed if I could see a thing. The sound stopped, but I kept on looking at where it had come from in case somebody moved. And in a minute, it started off again, but louder. You couldn't have called it a chuckle anymore. It was a real belly laugh. It just rang through the night. I wondered it didn't wake my servants. It sounded like someone who was roaring drunk. "Who's there?" I shouted. The only answer I got was a roar of laughter. I don't mind telling you I was getting a bit annoyed. I had half a mind to go down and see what it was all about. I wasn't going to let some drunken swine kick up a row like that on my place in the middle of the night. And then suddenly there was a yell. By God, I was startled. Then cries. The man had laughed with a deep bass voice, but his cries were shrill like a pig having his throat cut. "My God!" I cried. I jumped over the parapet and ran down towards the sound. I thought somebody was being killed. There was silence, and then one piercing shriek. After that, sobbing and moaning. I'll tell you what it sounded like. It sounded like someone at the point of death. There was a long groan, and then nothing. Silence. I ran from place to place. I couldn't find anyone. At last, I climbed the hill again and went back to my room. You can imagine how much sleep I got that night. As soon as it was light, I looked out of the window in the direction from which the row had come, and I was surprised to see a little white house in a sort of dale among the olives. The ground on that side didn't belong to us, and I'd never been through it. I hardly ever went to that part of the house, and so I'd never seen the house before. I asked Jose who lived there. He told me that a madman had inhabited it, with his brother and a servant. "Oh, was that the explanation?" I said. "Not a very nice neighbor." The Scot bent over quickly and seized my wrist. He thrust his face into mine, and his eyes were starting out of his head with terror. "The madman had been dead for 20 years, he whispered. He let go my wrist and leant back in his chair, panting. I went down to the house and walked all round it. The windows were barred and shuttered and the door was locked. I knocked. I shook the handle and rang the bell. I heard it tinkle, but no one came. It was a two-story house, and I looked up. The shutters were tight closed, and there wasn't a sign of life anywhere. "Well, what sort of condition was the house in?" I asked. "Oh, rotten. The whitewash had worn off the walls, and there was practically no paint left on the door or the shutters. Some of the tiles off the roof were lying on the ground. They looked as though they'd been blown away in a gale." "Queer," I said. I went to my friend Fernandez, the chemist, and he told me the same story as Jose. I asked about the madman, and Fernandez said that no one ever saw him. He was more or less comatose ordinarily, but now and then he had an attack of acute mania, and then he could be heard from ever so far, laughing his head off and then crying. It used to scare people. He died in one of his attacks, and his keepers cleared out at once. No one had ever dared to live in the house since. I didn't tell Fernandez what I'd heard. I thought he'd only laugh at me. I stayed up that night and kept watch, but nothing happened. There wasn't a sound. I waited about till dawn, and then I went to bed. "And you never heard anything more?" "Not for a month. The drought continued, and I went on sleeping in the lumber room at the back. One night I was fast asleep when something seemed to happen to me. I don't exactly know how to describe it. It was a funny feeling, as though someone had given me a little nudge to warn me, and suddenly I was wide awake. I lay there in my bed, and then, in the same way as before, I heard a long, low gurgle, like a man enjoying an old joke. It came from away down in the valley, and it got louder. It was a great bellow of laughter. I jumped out of bed and went to the window. My legs began to tremble. It was horrible to stand there and listen to the shouts of laughter that rang through the night. Then there was the pause, and after that, a shriek of pain, and that ghastly sobbing. It didn't sound human. I mean, you might have thought it was an animal being tortured. I don't mind telling you I was scared stiff. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. After a time, the sounds stopped, not suddenly, but dying away little by little. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear a thing. I crept back to bed and hid my face. I remembered then that Fernandez had told me that the madman's attacks only came at intervals. The rest of the time he was quite quiet. "Apathetic," Fernandez said. I wondered if the fits of mania came regularly. I reckoned out how long it had been between the two attacks I'd heard. 28 days. It didn't take me long to put two and two together. It was quite obvious that it was the full moon that set him off. I'm not a nervous man, really, and I made up my mind to get to the bottom of it, so I looked out in the calendar which day the moon would be full next, and that night I didn't go to bed. I cleaned my revolver and loaded it. I prepared a lantern and sat down on the parapet of my house to wait. I felt perfectly cool. To tell you the truth, I was rather pleased with myself because I didn't feel scared. There was a bit of a wind, and it whistled about the roof. It rustled over the leaves of the olive trees like waves swishing on the pebbles of the beach. The moon shone on the white walls of the house in the hollow. I felt particularly cheery. At last I heard a little sound, the sound I knew, and I almost laughed. I was right. It was the full moon, and the attacks came as regular as clockwork. That was all to the good. I threw myself over the wall into the olive grove and ran straight to the house. The chuckling grew louder as I came near. I got to the house and looked up. There was no light anywhere. I put my ears to the door and listened. I heard the madman simply laughing his bloody head off. I beat on the door with my fist and I pulled the bell. The sound of it seemed to amuse him. He roared with laughter. I knocked again, louder and louder, and the more I knocked, the more he laughed. Then I shouted at the top of my voice, "Open the blasted door, or I'll break it down!" I stepped back and kicked the latch with all my might. I flung myself at the door with the whole weight of my body. It cracked. Then I put all my strength into it, and the damned thing smashed open. I took the revolver out of my pocket and held my lantern in the other hand. The laughter sounded louder now that the door was opened. I stepped in. The stink nearly knocked me down. I mean, just think, the windows hadn't been opened for 20 years. The row was enough to raise the dead, but for a moment, I didn't know where it was coming from. The walls seemed to throw the sound backwards and forwards. I pushed open a door by my side and went into a room. It was bare and white, and there wasn't a stick of furniture in it. The sound was louder, and I followed it. I went into another room, but there was nothing there. I opened a door and found myself at the foot of a staircase. The madman was laughing just over my head. I walked up, cautiously, you know. I wasn't taking any risks. And at the top of the stairs there was a passage. I walked along it, throwing my light ahead of me, and I came to a room at the end. I stopped. He was in there. I was only separated from the sound by a thin door. It was awful to hear it. A shiver passed through me, and I cursed myself because I began to tremble. It wasn't like a human being at all. By Jove, I very nearly took to my heels and ran. I had to clench my teeth to force myself to stay, but I simply couldn't bring myself to turn the handle. And then the laughter was cut with a knife, you'd have said, and I heard a hiss of pain. I hadn't heard that before. It was too low to carry to my place, and then a gasp. I heard the man speak in Spanish. "You're killing me! Take it away! Oh, God, help me!" He screamed. The brutes were torturing him. I flung open the door and burst in. The draft blew a shutter back, and the moon streamed in so bright that it dimmed my lantern. In my ears, as clearly as I hear you speak and as close, I heard the wretched chap's groans. It was awful, moaning and sobbing and frightful gasps. No one could survive that. He was at the point of death. I tell you, I heard his broken, choking cries right in my ears. And the room was empty. Robert Morrison sank back in his chair. That huge, solid man had strangely the look of a clay figure in a studio. You felt that if you pushed him, he would fall over in a heap onto the floor. "And then?" I asked. He took a rather dirty handkerchief out of his pocket and wiped his forehead. I felt I didn't much want to sleep in that room on the north side, so, heat or no heat, I moved back to my own quarters. Well, exactly 4 weeks later, about 2 in the morning, I was waked up by the madman's chuckle. It was almost at my elbow. I don't mind telling you that my nerve was a bit shaken by then, so next time the blighter was due to have an attack, next time the moon was full, I got Fernandez to come and spend the night with me. I didn't tell him anything. I kept him up playing cards till 2 in the morning, and then I heard it again. I asked him if he heard anything. "Nothing," he said. "There's somebody laughing," I said. "You're drunk, man," he said. And he began laughing too. That was too much. "Shut up, you fool," I said. The laughter grew louder and louder. I cried out. I tried to shut it out by putting my hands to my ears, but it wasn't a damned bit of good. I heard it, and I heard the scream of pain. Fernandez thought I was mad. He didn't dare say so because he knew I'd have killed him. He said he'd go to bed, and in the morning I found he'd slunk away. His bed hadn't been slept in. He'd taken himself off when he left me. After that, I couldn't stop in a seizure. I put a factor there and went back to Seville. I felt myself pretty safe there, but as the time came near, I began to get scared. Of course, I told myself not to be a damned fool, but, I damned well couldn't help myself. The fact is, I was afraid the sounds had followed me, and I knew if I heard them in Seville, I'd go on hearing them all my life. I've got as much courage as any man, but damn it all, there are limits to everything. Flesh and blood couldn't stand it. I knew I'd go stark staring mad. I got in such a state that I began drinking. The suspense was so awful, and I used to lie awake counting the days. And at last I knew it had come. And it came. I heard those sounds in Seville, 60 miles away from Akija. I didn't know what to say. I was silent for a while. "When did you hear the sounds last?" I asked. 4 weeks ago. I looked up quickly. I was startled. "What do you mean by that? It's not full moon tonight?" He gave me a dark, angry look. He opened his mouth to speak and then stopped, as though he couldn't. You would have said his vocal cords were paralyzed, and it was with a strange croak that at last he answered. "Yes, it is." He stared at me, and his pale blue eyes seemed to shine red. I have never seen in a man's face a look of such terror. He got up quickly and stalked out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I must admit that I didn't sleep any too well that night myself.